Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started here. I want to welcome you to this event where ITIF is releasing a new report on Chinese economic policy, particularly related to innovation. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of ITIF, and we actually had a little bit of difficulties this morning with speakers. Claire Reed from USTR unfortunately came down with illness this morning, emailed me, and she was not able to be here. Morgan got rear-ended on the Beltway, and he is now here. And
oh, good.
Well, Jeremy is just in time, so thank you. And Senator Merkley will join us probably around 10:10 and come in and make some remarks. So I'll start with introducing our panelists. Then I'll make some remarks about the findings and recommendations in our report. Probably at that point turn to Morgan and then Jeremy and Senator Merkley in where we can. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll adjourn at precisely 11 o'clock. So let me start with Senator Merkley. Senator Jeff Merkley is a Democrat from Oregon. He serves on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and also the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, Environment and Public Works, and also the Budget Committee. He began his public service as an intern with former Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, returned to Oregon in the early 90s, led Habitat for Humanity, became a state rep, and then elected Democratic leader in the state assembly and speaker in 2007. Morgan Reed is the executive director of the Association for Competitive Technology. And Morgan really is wearing two hats for this event. One hat is a technology expert, and particularly understanding the dynamics of small and emerging technology firms and how they're facing global competition. But also the hat is his expertise in China. Morgan began his career in Taiwan and China. He was experienced there with telecom and technology policy issues. He is a leading technology expert. He's been on CNN, CNBC, ABC, etc. And also, I believe, speaks Chinese, which is very valuable. And he also lectures in both English and Chinese on various aspects of U.S.-China trade. And last but not least is Jeremy Waterman, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Asia in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he's responsible for developing and executing the U.S. Chamber policy initiatives in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Mongolia, as well as steering the Chamber's policy work in the Asia-Pacific region. Before joining the Chamber, Jeremy worked for 5 years for the U.S.-China Business Council and was also in USTR and has a master's degree from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston. So let me start by trying to frame this and why we think this is an important issue. In the early 1980s, Deng Xiaoping, who was the leader of the Communist Party, he announced what he called his Four Modernizations program. And a key part of that agenda was to open up China to foreign direct investment, to open up to the West, to drive economic growth through FDI. And that was the strategy that they had pursued for a quarter of a century, to great success. While the consequences of that strategy might not have always been good for U.S. production workers who lost jobs because of production, particularly commodity-based manufacturing, going over to China, certainly U.S. companies benefited from that relationship, and certainly U.S. consumers benefited from that relationship. And so occasionally there would be a complaint once in a while from U.S. industry about something China was doing, but largely that relationship worked. But in 2006, that fundamentally changed. That's really what our thesis is, that China has fundamentally switched strategies. It was largely an FDI attraction strategy, and now China is focusing on what they call indigenous innovation. And what indigenous innovation is, according to one Chinese document, It says indigenous innovation refers to enhancing original innovation, integrated innovation, and re-innovation based on assimilation and absorption of imported technology in order to improve our national innovation capability. So this was the new goal, and you can see that goal reflected in a wide array of documents that the Chinese government has put out. The principal one being the guidelines for the implementation of the National Medium and Long-Term Program for Science and Technology Development, published in 2006. This was what people call the MLP. And if you read the MLP, which I encourage you to do, it's a pretty interesting document. The MLP sought to, quote, create an environment for encourage innovation independently, to promote enterprises to become the main body of making technological innovation, and to strive to build an innovative type company. You know, so far so good. Nothing wrong with that. Every country is trying to gain wealth and increase per capita living standards through innovation. But I think where the MLP is distinctive is in a couple of ways. One was the breadth of it. In the back of the report, there's an appendix with all 402 technologies that the MLP targets. Precision chemicals, intelligent automobiles, genomic sequencing, intelligent materials, superconducting motors, aerospace. So the MLP basically said, every technology that we can imagine in the world is what we want to be good at. There's no division of labor here. There's no specialization. It's just we want to be good at it all. So clearly the MLP was aspirational, but what we see later is that the Chinese government narrowed that focus and targeted it a bit more. And the most recent example of that is the Chinese, the 12th fifth-year plan, which just came out. By the way, come on up, there's some seats up here in the front, here, and a bunch over here, so. And the 12th five-year plan commits to 7 strategic industries. These are energy efficiency and environment, IT, biotechnology, high-end equipment manufacturing, new energy, new materials, and new energy vehicles. So they focused on 7 core technologies that they want to master. And the aim, which is really at the end of the day, the fundamental goal of the Chinese economic policy now, the aim is to increase the share of these, the value added of these 7 industries from about 2% of GDP in 2008 to 15% in 2020. Just to give you an example, all of U.S. manufacturing, it's about 11% of value added in the U.S. 11% of GDP is all of our manufacturing. They want these 7 industries to account for 15% of their GDP. And they're not shy about getting there. They're planning, they've announced a commitment of $1.5 trillion, the equivalent of, over the next 5 years. Just to give you an example, I'll give you a way to judge how big that is. On a per GDP basis, we would have to pass an American Recovery and Reinvestment Act every year for 5 years and devote 100% of the funds to 7 industries. So we did it once, and most of it didn't go to industry, went to consumers. So what the Chinese are trying to do, I think, is really unprecedented. They're trying to take global leadership in a whole set of technology industries. As Thomas Hout and Pankaj Gamatwat described in the Harvard Business Review, China's goal is to, quote, create a tipping point in which multinational corporations will have to locate their most sophisticated R&D projects and facilities in China, enabling it eventually to catch up with the world, with the U.S. as the world's most advanced economy. One really interesting area where you see that is in aviation. There's basically 2 main aviation players in the world, Boeing and Airbus, and then you have 2 sort of minor players, Bombardier and Embraer, and the Chinese are not happy with that, and they want to be one of the top global aviation companies in the world, making wide-body jets. There's really no need for another wide-body jet maker. The global market's not all that big. It's adequately served by 2, and there is absolutely no possible way that a new entrant could come into this market and win any possible market share unless you distort the market. If it was just like some company in the U.S. says, we're going to start building wide-body jets, they would never, ever raise a dime because the business model doesn't work. But the Chinese have committed to being a leader in global aviation and to being a leading global exporter of jet aircraft. And they're going to do that through the fact that they control 90% of the Chinese aviation, the airline demand market through their aircraft, for their airline industries, forced tech transfer, and massive export subsidies. So what we really argue in this report is that China fundamentally wants to gain absolute advantage, not comparative advantage. In other words, they want to be good and dominant in every industry, aviation, biotechnology, IT, software, you name it, and still maintain their advantage in commodity-based manufacturing. So at that point, what's left for the U.S.? What's left for the U.S. hopefully is not what our major two exports are now by value. If you look at our major exports by ocean container, they're actually waste paper and scrap metal. So we'll supply China with waste paper and scrap metal. They'll turn that into high value added products and sell it back to us, and all funded by buying our T-bills. So the goal of absolute advantage, I would argue, runs counter to the effective functioning of a global trading system, which is based on the notion of competitive advantage. Somebody's good at something, they use that to export, to gain the revenues, to buy what they're not good at. It would be one thing if China was trying to do this through what you might call, what we've called good innovation policies, things like R&D tax credit, funding for science, STEM education, and the like. And certainly China is doing some of that. But most of what China is doing is in what we would call innovation mercantilism. Most of the Chinese effort to gain this advantage is not through sort of normal science and technology policies that countries like the United States and Europe and other countries embrace. They're doing it through a set of policies that you can define as mercantilist. And those policies have really two, I think, distinguishing factors and features. One is the scope and the size. A lot of countries have mercantilist policies, like the Argentines and the Brazilians and the Indians. But the Chinese have really perfected this. The scale of these policies are much bigger. The sophistication is much stronger. But the second main aspect of these policies is their orientation to Chinese-owned firms. That's what I think a lot of people miss. Most governments will provide incentives to any company within their borders, regardless of nationality. The Chinese strategy is really to give preferential treatment to Chinese-owned firms, and in some cases to actively discriminate against foreign firms. So I want to talk just a little bit about some of these indigenous innovation policies oriented to helping Chinese-owned firms. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I think we need to do. Clearly, the kind of obvious one that everybody talks about when they hear about indigenous innovation, almost everybody who writes about this equates it to the 2009 Indigenous Innovation Product Accreditation Scheme the Chinese had. So this was a program where the Chinese said, we're going to use government procurement, which is 20% of Chinese GDP. We're going to use that as a way not just to buy Chinese-made goods, which is what they do now. They don't buy almost no imported goods on their government procurement. We're going to do something more. We're going to tie that to a list of products that has IP based in China. If you don't have IP based in China, you can't get in this product list. And of course, lo and behold, when they look at some of these product catalogs, like in Shanghai or some of the other products, very few American companies who were producing in China could qualify for this product list. And as we know now, there was great outrage and uproar about this from the Chinese and the Europeans and even the Japanese. And the Chinese backed off of this, and Hu Jintao rescinded this last year in a strategic and economic dialogue with the Obama administration, and the Obama administration deserves credit for getting them to back off. But it's really too early to tell whether there's any effect on this. There's an interesting translation of the December document that the Chinese central government, NDRC, sent out to the provinces, telling them, we've now rescinded this. You have to stop doing it. But if you read what the document says, at least perhaps maybe it's bad English translation work, and you can read it and tell me whether the translation works, but the translation I read said two things. Don't talk about this anymore. And secondly, don't put it in writing anymore. So it wasn't, there was nothing in the circular that said stop, at least nothing I could read in the translation I got. It just said don't talk about it, don't write about it. So they may still continue to do this. It just would be more opaque than it might have been before. Moreover, this rescission does not apply to purchases made by SOEs. They can continue to do this, nor to NDRC concession projects. So I would argue that the procurement problem has not been eliminated. It's been pushed back a bit. Hopefully we'll see progress. Second big area is forced joint venture requirements. 100% of foreign investments in China are screened, and frequently firms are required to enter into JVs, partly to keep the profits in China, which is a little strange when you think about it, but China has the largest foreign reserve accumulation of any country in world history, and yet they don't want profits to flow out of the country. And also do JVs to help so that the technology is transferred into foreign firms. And that relates to the second part of the JV policy, which is forced tech transfer. The Chinese accession agreement to the WTO prohibits them from tying FDI to requirements to technology transfer. And they will say, we don't do this. In fact, they do this. They just, again, they don't put it in writing. But they do tie FDI to tech transfer. For example, the 2007 catalog for the guidance of foreign investment industries tech transfer agreement shows that you have to submit a tech transfer agreement for approval. Sometimes this is in the form of just mandatory licensing. The chairman of BASF, the German chemical company, was recently quoted as saying, foreign companies doing business in China face, quote, forced disclosure of know-how. And you hear that over and over and over again. In other cases, there are requirements to open up R&D labs. We were over in Nanjing this summer and visited a Ford Motor R&D facility. And I asked somebody there, why is Ford putting an R&D lab here with 200 employees? And they said, well, because the joint venture that they have down the block or down the road where they're producing the cars, the requirement to do, first of all, Ford can't come into China and just make cars. They have to do a JV. But the requirement of the JV was you had to open up an R&D lab. And we're looking out the window and we see another building being erected like right across the way. And I said, what's that building? And they said, oh, well, that's the R&D lab for the second factory. So Ford is building a second factory there. That has to come with an R&D lab. And again, as Hout and Jamadi say, the Chinese central government required foreign firms to, quote, form joint ventures with its national champions and transfer the latest technology in exchange for current and future business opportunities. Companies that resist are simply excluded from projects. Another area is the weak and discriminatory patent system. So the Chinese, you read a lot about how the Chinese are issuing just scores of patents, thousands of patents, more patents than the US. But the reality is that about 3/4 of most of those patents are utility model patents, what some people call junk patents, not really patents as we would think of them. And about 3/4 of those are issued to Chinese-owned firms. And about half of those, one study argued, were used for the simple purpose of being able to sue foreign firms for patent infringement. So a really emblematic case of that was the French electronics company Schneider a few years ago. They sued a Chinese company called the Chint Group for infringing on its patents in Europe. They won the cases, a couple of cases. Chint then got their own patents, which, you know, I don't know exactly what happened there, but the assertion is that they basically just took the Schneider technology, got a Chinese patent on it, then sued Schneider in the Chinese court, and the Chinese Intermediate People's Court fined Schneider $50 million. So again, Schneider could have fought it, but they said, you know, we want to keep doing business in China. We will just pay the fine. And this was widely seen as a message by the Chinese, as the Chinese central government sending a message saying, don't fight us on patents because we will reciprocate in our own courts. The most recent case of that is the iPad trademark case, which most of you hopefully followed. A Chinese company called ProView Technology claims that it owns the trademark to iPad, even though Apple bought the trademark from the company and has emails to prove it, and they're suing Apple for, I can't remember what it is, $2.5 billion, some enormous amount of money. We'll see what happens with that, whether Apple fights it all the way through, and if so, whether the courts are objective or not. Another area is IP theft. Again, we hear a lot about IP theft, but even though China signed on to TRIPS, they turn a blind eye to IP theft. The International Trade Commission recently, last year, estimated that in 2009, Chinese IP theft caused $48 billion of economic losses for the U.S. annually. A good example of that, where you see that, is in PC operating systems. So Microsoft, there are about the same number of PCs in China. Actually, there are more PCs in China than there are in the U.S. And yet, Microsoft China revenue on the operating system on Windows is 5% of what it is in the U.S. So in other words, most of the operating systems on Chinese computers are actually stolen. They're illegally copied. You could argue, well, that's just kind of the way things work in poor countries. People don't have any money, and there's not a lot of law enforcement. But the fact that 80% of government computers are running pirated versions of Windows just suggests that they really don't take this problem seriously. Again, there's like 2, 3, 4 seats if folks want to come on up. Feel free to do that. I was recently reading an article in the Journal of Science and Technology Policy in China, which is a very interesting English language journal that's edited by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And this was a journal about essentially the cell phone industry cluster in Shenzhen, which they call the Shanghai ethos. Morgan will correct me. It's not even close to what it means.
It's painful. Let's just keep going.
It's painful. My daughter's learning Chinese. I'm not. There's a reason I'm not learning Chinese. But it said, quote, this cell phone cluster, which is this massive cluster of companies that are making, one company will make a little thing, and another company will make a little thing, and then all assemble and make cell phones. They say, quote, this is turning to the Shanghai ethos, starting with producing counterfeited mobile phones to, this is a quote, to rebel against the expensive world-leading brands. The Shanghai idea of rebellion has evolved into a desire to take on global corporations by producing copies of leading brands. The authors then go on to note how those in the central government tend to tacit consent of this phenomenon. So here you have an article in the Chinese Academy of Sciences journal that is just saying piracy is just another business model. Not only that, but it's a fair business model because you're taking on those big, greedy multinational corporations by stealing their IP and making phones. We see that now. I think the emerging issue for China is trade secret theft. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen articles about various American companies where Chinese officials or their agents have been bribing engineers and other folks in these companies to basically steal their IP. We saw that with the case of American Superconductor, which is a company that makes wind turbine software and other things, where the Chinese, their major customers, stole and bribed to steal their technology. And we saw it with DuPont recently, where the Department of Justice has filed a case against a person here who's accused of being part of the Chinese Communist Party to steal the trade secrets from DuPont. And we see that also with cyber espionage. So I think you have to remember the Chinese strategy is to get as much foreign technology as possible. And they will use any means possible, including cyber espionage. And we saw that recent articles of Nortel Networks, if anybody read those. Nortel, the now almost defunct telecom equipment company in Canada, they found very recently that since the year 2000, their computer systems had been penetrated, and technical papers, R&D reports, business plans, and employee emails were being sent to Shanghai and Beijing. Now, maybe this is not looked at, maybe this is not part of the government, it's unclear, but certainly somebody in China was breaking into the Nortel network to steal on trade secrets. A U.S. government intelligence report recently stated, quote, Chinese actors are the world's most active and persistent perpetrators of economic espionage. Another area we see this is in domestic technology standards. So at least in the IT industry, there's a process by which standards are developed that are global, voluntary, and industry-led. So whenever there's a new device that comes out, all the firms from all around the world, Europe, Japan, America, they get together, they develop a standard, and then everybody builds to the standard. This is why when we go to other countries, our phones work and our Wi-Fi works and all of that. Chinese have decided they want to do a different type of policy. Chinese have adopted essentially a government-led standards process designed really around two main purposes. One, to ensure that they have the standards so that they don't have to pay royalties to foreign companies, and secondly, to keep foreign products out or make them more expensive. We saw that a few years ago with what was called WAPI, the Wireless Local Area Network Authentication and Privacy Infrastructure. You talk to most engineers and they will tell you that WAPI is an inferior standard for encryption and security, that the other standard, that's the globally accepted one, is a much better standard, but the Chinese have adopted WAPI. And a recent study showed there are at least 15 internationally accepted IT standards that the Chinese have made their own domestic standards with the purpose of putting them in compulsory into products sold in China. As China scholar Dieter Ernst points out, China's accession commitments to the WTO have substantially reduced the use of most other trade restrictions such as tariffs, imports, and quotas, and that's why they're turning to standards now. Another area is benefits to SOEs. There's, I think, a common view in the U.S. that the Chinese are moving toward this reform model and we're shrinking their SOEs. And certainly to some extent they got rid of a lot of inefficient SOEs, but in the last 8 years the share of the Chinese economy accounted for by SOEs has gone up. And there's a recent study by the Unirule Institute in China which found that the rate of return of SOEs that American companies compete against, American companies basically have to earn a rate of return of 10, 20%, 30% on invested capital. Chinese have to earn a rate of return of negative 6.29. So when you are basically competing against a company that can run losses year after year after year, you've got a big leg up in that company. And that 6.29 is basically including all of the incentives that they get in the cash and all. Another area is tax incentives. The Chinese put in place a very impressive scheme or tax policy called the China New Tech Enterprises tax policy, and it basically lowers taxes on innovation income. However, there have been a number of reports, including one from Deloitte, which says it appears that obtaining the HNTE status will be difficult for most China affiliates of MNCs. So again, unless you move your technology there and give it to them, you just don't get this lower tax break. Imagine the U.S. saying, we'll have an R&D tax credit, but it doesn't apply to Siemens. Siemens in the U.S. We're only going to give it to GE in the U.S. That's essentially what this is doing. So what I would argue is that this new shift to indigenous innovation focused on helping Chinese-owned firms through mercantilist policies really changes the dynamics. It changes it back to what it used to be like when the U.S. was competing with Japan back in the 80s, where the Japanese wouldn't let U.S. companies into their market. They had the standards discrimination. They had a whole set of other policies, including pricing under cost to gain advantage. And the U.S. companies felt frustrated. They turned to the U.S. government for support, and we pushed back against the Japanese to some success. That's, I think, what's going on today. And when you talk to the Japanese, talk to the Chinese, as I have in many meetings, and I've kept a long, detailed list of what I might call justifications for Chinese mercantilist innovation policies. There's a long, long list that they give you. Well, you have mercantilist policies too, you know. If we don't do this, we're not going to have adequate foreign exchange reserves. Give us time. We're still learning. You really shouldn't blame us. Your economy, it's your own fault. You screwed up with the financial crisis and housing. And so there's a whole list of excuses. But the main two that the Chinese use, and unfortunately I think a lot of Americans have bought into this, is if China doesn't do this, if they don't run a mercantilist export-led strategy moving up the value chain, they're just going to not have enough, create enough jobs for the people in China, and the place will dissolve into chaos, and we just don't want that. So that's okay. We'll let them keep doing this because we don't want chaos. The fact is, when you look at the data and you look at countries' job growth and their trade deficit or surplus, there is zero correlation. Zero correlation. There's no relationship, at least for medium and large-sized countries, between running a trade deficit and creating jobs. They just don't exist. One overview of the economics literature, a scholarly study, looked at all of the literature on trade and job creation, and it showed, in the long run, aggregate net employment largely is unaffected by international factors. An NBER study, National Bureau of Economic Research, found that, quote, while exports have become increasingly important for stimulating Chinese employment, the same gains could be obtained from growth in domestic demand. So again, this Chinese excuse that they have to be running this big export-led economy in order to gain jobs just simply is not true from an economic perspective. The other argument they'll use is they have to do this to raise their standard of living. And again, I encourage you to look at a McKinsey Global Institute study, which we cite in here, that found, looking at all 10 countries around the world, it's that the rate of your per capita growth is really unrelated to your industry mix. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you have some biotech or whether you have some software. What really matters is whether you have broad-scale productivity growth. We did a little calculation in the report, and if the Chinese achieve their goal in the strategic and emerging industries of getting to 15% of GDP, that will be the equivalent of 14 months of Chinese growth at current rates. So in other words, their major goal of getting global dominance in these industries just gets them 14 months of growth. It's not the path that they have to go down. So what should we do about this? I think part of it is to get the right frame, to analyze the problem the right way. Unfortunately, in our view, there's two prevailing views of China in Washington. One is, and neither of them really work, one of them is the free trade view. If we push China to reduce their mercantilism, these efforts will backfire. Besides, trade is win-win. Ricardo said that, trade's win-win. Even if one side is a mercantilist, as long as we're free traders, it's a win-win. The other side, the other view, is the protectionist view, which essentially says we can't compete against China. How can you compete against a country where labor costs are 6 to 7% of US worker wages? There's no way we can do this. We'd better impose our own tariffs, our own Buy American provisions, build our own autarkic economy. Well, both views really miss the mark. Free traders are right. It's in the US interest for China to be an integral part of the global economy, but only if they're playing by the rules. Certainly Chinese innovation mercantilist policies lead to lost jobs in the US. They distort the global allocation of production. They lower global productivity. That's a great Boston Consulting Group report a few years ago showed that Chinese policies actually lower global productivity. They don't raise it, they lower it. They reduce incentives for the production of knowledge. When you're stealing IP and doing forced tech transfer, you're reducing the returns to knowledge. And they fragment global markets through scale economies. So this notion somehow that if we just sort of keep going and turn a blind eye, that it's in our interest, I think is mistaken. But so is really the protectionist view. I don't see any reason why we can't be a robust competitor to China as long as we put in place good innovation policies and the Chinese resist or desist from these other kinds of protectionist policies. So what do we need to do specifically? The report lays out a number of ideas. It's not intended to be a complete roadmap of ideas. But in the sort of broadest terms, I've been reading George Kennan's biography recently, and I was struck by a lot of the phrasing that he had, which is to contain and roll back Soviet communist expansionism. I actually think that's not a bad way to think about this. I think the goal here is to contain and roll back Chinese innovation mercantilism. I think that should be the goal. And I think the single most important step to do that is recognize what a big and severe issue this is. One strategy that I would argue we shouldn't do is that oftentimes the way we look at Chinese innovation mercantilism and the loss of jobs in the US is essentially to blame the US companies. So if you read that whole New York Times story on Apple, this was largely a strategy. Our strategy is blame. We will shame US companies to not go over there. That's not a real strategy. The reason U.S. companies go over there, in part because it makes business sense, and in part because the Chinese policies make it so that they have to. So I think we need to start by taking stronger action under existing authorities. When you look at what USTR is doing, they're doing a very, very good job, but on very, very thin resources. And if you talk to Claire Reed, who is leading the China effort, I mean, those folks do a great job, but the U.S. invests just 0.007% on trade enforcement as we do on national security. So we spend an enormous amount of money defending our military and national security interests in this country, and we spend almost nothing defending our economic interests. So clearly, I think one of the best spent dollar we could spend in the U.S. government would be to really expand USTR resources and customs resources and U.S. ITC resources. The President's proposal has some proposals to do that in there, and I hope that folks in Congress will take those seriously. A second big area I think we can do is, a lot of times USTR will not bring cases to the WTO because the companies that are involved don't want a case brought. And the reason they don't want a case brought is not because they don't think they can win it, but because if they bring a case, they will experience severe retaliation from the Chinese government. And we've heard this from many, many companies we've talked to. If you make waves in China, the Chinese government will make sure that you pay for that. And so one of the ways around that conundrum is to essentially make it national policy that USTR will independently bring cases when they believe the U.S. economic interests are hurt. We shouldn't wait for companies to come forward. And in fact, we should absolve companies from blame or from worry here by just saying, this is the policy, we're doing it. And if the Chinese don't like it, they can blame USTR and the Obama administration or whatever administration is in power. Another area I think we need to do is we need to empower U.S. firms more to defend their interests. One of the reasons why U.S. companies transfer technology there, because if they don't, their competitor will. They'll have nothing. Their competitors, China still gets the technology, and they get nothing in the market. So one idea that we could explore would be the idea of an antitrust waiver that DOJ could give firms where they would collaborate in the same industry and basically have an antitrust waiver regarding technology transfer and investment agreements so they can just not be played off against one another. Another area I would argue we need to focus on is shift from essentially a whack-a-mole strategy to a results-based strategy. We keep thinking that if we keep winning these either cases or negotiations that we're winning. In fact, partly by the time we've won, there's been a lot of damage done. And secondly, the Chinese have shown they can erect more and better barriers and mercantilist policies faster than we can get rid of the old ones. So I think we can never win that game. I think what we've got to do is demand from China that they actually show real results. And let me suggest 5 real results. One is a reduction of their global trade surplus. Second, reduced levels of piracy. Third, the use of global rather than domestic technology standards. Fourth, the total relief, with the exception of maybe some national security industries, of requirements for joint ventures. And fifth, seeing a real reduction of the share of SOEs in the economy. Those are all measurable outcomes. The Chinese could accomplish those if they wanted to, and we could hold them accountable to do that. And the last thing I would argue we need to do is ultimately we can't win pushing back against Chinese innovation and mercantilism unless we form a strong coalition. And there's where I think we've really got to focus on getting an alliance with our European allies, perhaps all Commonwealth nations, perhaps the Japanese, and to form a coalition a bit like we did with the Plaza Accord back in the Reagan era, but a real coalition to press China to shape up and live and play by the rules of the game. One way to do that would be to create a transatlantic partnership, a new trade agreement with Europe. This would be essentially, Morgan Reed has a wonderful, I don't know if you've written this or you're just talking about it, but the best way to deal with China is to not deal with China. Morgan can say a little bit more about that, but basically make the Chinese want to be part of this, and the only way they can be part of it, which we want them to be, is to play by the rules. So let me just close by saying, why haven't we done this? And the reason I think we haven't done it is basically a lot of what I've said. I think there's significant opposition to in Washington. Many other think tanks would see what we just proposed as antithetical to the U.S. interest. And they use essentially 4 or 5 main arguments to say that what I just said was wrong. The one that's sort of in vogue now is, don't really worry about this, just be patient. China's about to fail. This is sort of like communism's about to take over. You know, what's called communists always believe the proletariat revolution just about happened. It just hasn't happened yet. Just be patient, it'll happen. So any nation really misguided enough to do what the Chinese are doing, there's no way they can win. They're going to fail. Only a country like America can succeed. So let's just be patient, let them fail on their own. 2 problems with that. I don't think the Chinese are going to fail. And secondly, even if they do, they can do a lot of damage, as they have done to the U.S. economy, U.S. technology, and U.S. firms. A second argument is essentially just be patient because the Chinese are learning. This is complicated stuff. They're a developing country. You got to give them time. I heard that argument back in 2005 when the Bush administration was negotiating with China on IP. Just give them time, they'll learn. The fact that 80% of software is stolen by the Chinese government, they understand that you're not supposed to steal software. This isn't a question of learning. They know, they just don't do. So as Keynes once said, in the long run we're all dead. Eventually if China learns, which they will, you know, you can't keep doing this forever, so in 30 or 40 years they will evolve into a more market-based free trade economy. I don't have any doubt about that. But the damage that will be done is significant in the meantime. Another argument is that we benefit from China trade, so don't rock the boat. We absolutely do benefit from China trade, but we don't benefit from mercantilist policies. Mercantilist policies distort the global marketplace, they lower economic welfare. So it's not it's posed as a false choice. Don't trade with China or get tough with them. In reality, what we want to do is we want China to be part of the global trade. We want to engage with them, we want to invest, we want them to invest, but we want it to be done in a fair way. Another argument, which Bob Rubin was recently quoted in the Washington Post, is saying, look, all of our problems are our fault, don't blame China. Blaming China is China bashing, or in some cases, what a European official called me recently and over at a meeting in 10 Downing Street, called me a racist for making what I just said. Called me a racist, because obviously if you press a country on their mercantilist policies, you don't like them. And this is just, you know, really, to me, missing the point. Yes, we need to get our house in order. Yes, a lot of our economic problems are our own making, but not all of them. And it doesn't let other countries off the hook. And the last argument people make is that efforts to roll back Chinese mercantilism will lead to a trade war. Well, the trade war has been going on for at least 5, if not 10 years. The Chinese have shot most of the volleys, and we've been losing. So getting tough with the Chinese is not protectionism. It's essentially, it's a defense of the global free market economy. And getting tough with them, I would argue, is only going to do 2 things. One is they tend to back off, as we saw with Indigenous innovation product catalogs when we get tough. And the second thing is, I think getting tough with them does embolden their reformers. And there are reformers in China who look at the world more the way we look at the world. And I think getting tough with China makes them in a better position. So let me just close by saying that I think that the challenge here is not just China, but it's what we end up terming the Beijing consensus, which I think is at the potential possibility of replacing the Washington consensus as the model for how you do development around the world. You've seen now countries like India that are saying, you know what, we want what those guys have. We're looking over there, we're seeing the Chinese growing at 10% a year, we're not. Let's model our economic policies after the Chinese. You see the Brazilians just decided to do that, put in place massive tariffs on their economy because they were being hurt by the Chinese. So there's a real risk that this is not just going to be about the Beijing consensus in China, but the Beijing consensus throughout the world, Russia, India, Brazil, and lots of other countries. So if we don't fight this and explain that there's a better way to develop, then I think the real risk is not just to China, but to the global trading system overall. So thank you, and I will turn it over to Morgan.
Bravo.
Well, after that, there's hard liquor in the back, and I think we can all pretty much just go home. So the world's coming to a horrible conclusion. I'm not here to be a China apologist. I'm looking at this from the perspective of trying to describe a little bit more of the what, why, and how. Rob outlined a lot of pretty strong concepts about mercantilist policies and where things are headed. But I think it's worth taking a step back and saying, why? Why did the Chinese do this? How did we get here? And are there some things that we can learn, lessons that we can take, and that we can do some things differently? I thought it was so cute on page 6 of Rob's paper, how he highlighted America's concept of everyone playing by the rules. I mean, that's such a Dudley Do-Right American way to look at it. There's a Chinese idiom, 人上北人欺，马上北人骑, which essentially means good people get cheated just like good horses get ridden. In short order, I think a big part of the problem that we as Americans face when going into negotiations with the Chinese in this case is that we walk in and assume that our reading of the rules is the same reading of the rules that everyone has. There's a famous George Clooney movie, I don't know how famous, everything George Clooney's in famous, he's so good looking, you know, where they constantly talk about the ironclad prenup and the mythical ironclad prenup. Well, Americans, when we enter into trade negotiations, often look at situations where we look at this paper that we've produced and say, well, this is an ironclad prenup. These are what we all agree to. Well, that's not necessarily true. A rule is what you can get away with, right? A rule is what you can get to the edge of and get away with. And our American concept is, well, we understand the core of what we're trying to achieve, so we're not about to walk up to the edge and say, well, you know, this comma, if it were here, would mean this, if it's here, it means that. Well, I think from a perspective of a Chinese negotiator, that's not being bad, that's being smart, that's being clever.
I'm going to interrupt you. Senator Merkley is here, and I want to let him, I know he has to run, so can I interrupt him, head back right where you are, and don't miss your thing?
I'm in the meeting. Is there something?
So, Senator Merkley, I introduced you earlier, so I won't do it again. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, okay. There's something that I need to know now?
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You were on a roll there. So you see where it all was headed. Greetings, everyone. It's great to be here. And thank you, Rob, for inviting me to come by, and particularly thank you for this report, appropriately titled "Enough is Enough." You know, there hasn't been enough conversation about how our trade relationship with China actually works, and I think this report provides a lot of detailed information that is very valuable in advancing that conversation. And I must say, ITIF has been a very strong voice for manufacturing in the U.S. And if you're going to be a voice on manufacturing, you have to wrestle with how trade impacts manufacturing in the United States of America. Now, there is a well-known joke about an economist, so apologies to the economists who are in the room, about the man who finds himself shipwrecked on a desert island. And fortunately, there is a crate of food that washed up, but unfortunately, it's canned tuna, and that's a problem. Many folks washed up on the island in that situation would be crestfallen with food close at hand and no way to open it. But the economist recognizes right away that his experiences make him well prepared for this challenge. And he says to himself, I'll simply assume a can opener. Problem solved. Well, and indeed, for many years we've based our economic relationships on assumptions about how trade is supposed to work. A level playing field between two economies, mutually enforced rules. But in the real world, it isn't operating that way. And indeed, American policymakers must come to grips with the fact that China is pursuing a powerful four-tiered industrial policy that vastly subsidizes manufacturing in China and undermines domestic manufacturing in other countries, particularly in the United States of America. Now, let me be absolutely clear. I love trade. I love the potential in trade. Each nation doing what it does best and exchanging those goods for goods the other nation does best, mutual benefit. But right now, it's like we're playing basketball and following all the rules while letting the other team lower the rim to 8 feet instead of 10 feet and skip the whole thing about dribbling. And the result is a global playing field tilted steeply in China's favor. So as I mentioned, China is pursuing a manufacturing strategy on 4 major fronts, all 4 of which are, in essence, subsidies. The first is unenforced environmental and labor standards. The second is currency manipulation. The third is direct and indirect grants and low-cost loans. And the third is predatory business practices, including discrimination and IP theft. So I'll try to address each of these. First, we have enforcement failure in environmental and labor laws. China does have very substantial laws on the books that can look very good when you're reading them, but it rarely enforces them, and the result is reduced costs for domestic manufacturers. This policy shifts high costs onto China's own population, who suffer from the environmental degradation and the abusive labor practices. Meanwhile, it creates a huge competitive disadvantage for manufacturers in America who operate under a well-enforced set of higher standards. In short, this trade dynamic incentivizes a race to the bottom on wages, working conditions, and the environment, which is far from the idyllic, mutually beneficial theory of trade on a level playing field. We need to recognize that the failure to enforce meaningful environmental and labor laws is a foreign manufacturing subsidy and must be addressed for American manufacturing to thrive. Second, we have the subsidy provided by the intentionally underpriced currency, the pegged Chinese currency. It makes Chinese exports artificially cheaper and our goods going to China artificially more expensive. You can think of it as a 25% tariff on American goods and a 25% subsidy to Chinese goods. That's a substantial advantage. And right now, this is not counted as a subsidy or a tariff, and that needs to be addressed. Third, the Chinese government provides immense subsidies through a vast array of direct and indirect grants, loans, and giveaways. From direct land grants to discounted utilities and ready-made factories, the Chinese government has routinely offered its exporters direct and indirect subsidies far in excess of what is allowed under the WTO for products being produced for export. You know, these subsidies have been rarely discussed. And after a trip to China last year, when I heard from a lot of American manufacturers in China and challenges, thought, you know, the WTO provides a requirement that you put out a notification of the subsidies you're providing related to export. So I teamed up with a couple of other senators, bipartisan, across-the-aisle effort, and we announced that we're going to pass legislation requiring, or we're going to attempt to pass it, requiring our trade representative to counter-notify, which is allowed under the WTO. Well, within about 2 weeks, this was published. Our trade representative put out a notice of 200 notifications. I encourage everybody to get this document from October 11, 2011, and read through these 200 subsidies that China has provided. What you will see is a substantial famous brand strategy, which has been rarely discussed in our country. China has said, you know, we really want to go after the famous brands. If we can get them here, if we can get the supply chain here, if we can vastly subsidize to move them here, then other industries will follow. And this lays those out very explicitly. Indeed, in this report are 83 subsidies at multiple levels of government tied to a specific central government strategy of famous export brands. Also in this are 30 subsidies related to renewable energy subsidy programs, which is another major strategy that we need to understand what China is pursuing and doing. In addition, China's entire banking system is structured to provide massive subsidies to its manufacturers. It works like this. The government fixes the interest paid by banks to citizens and controls the loans that are made, both ensuring substantial profits to the state-owned bank and enabling the state to subsidize the loans to favor activities like manufacturing. This system can be thought of in practice as a form of taxation on the citizens because of the suppressed interest rates that then funds reduced costs for manufacturing, which is a competitive advantage to China and a competitive disadvantage to the United States. And finally, discriminatory treatment of foreign enterprises. When our Senate delegation went to China and met with the American Chamber of Commerce last year, what surprised us was how vocal American companies are becoming about discrimination inside China. One after another, major American companies stood up and aired their grievances, which in the past they would not have aired because of the threat of being kicked out and their decades-long efforts to have access to the growing Chinese economy. So when those American companies are standing up and talking about their problems, you know that they've really reached a point of enormous frustration. But those things include forced IP transfers and lack of protection for IP intellectual property. We have the recent case where Chinese courts are saying Apple infringed on a Chinese company's trademark with the iPad name. We have actual theft of IP, the most notable example being Cisco's Huawei case, where Cisco's router technology was blatantly stolen. Discriminatory technology standards. Indeed, the concept of indigenous innovation is a strategy of setting tech standards that favor Chinese manufacturing over foreign manufacturing. And a lot of firms came to us before our delegation went overseas. Please keep stressing the Chinese the discriminatory nature of indigenous innovation and how harmful that will be. Opaque and discriminatory approval of licensing procedures without clear regulatory standards, without appeal to independent courts, and retaliatory actions against American companies that do complain. This set of practices is nothing less than a large and unfair subsidy to Chinese companies that undermines U.S. innovation and competitiveness, and it should be addressed. Whatever you want to call China's full-court press, mercantilism, trade distortion, or merely an all-out effort to gain global market share, it is industrial policy that violates the spirit and the letter of the WTO. While automation and other factors have also contributed, there is little doubt that this fourfold industrial policy has played a central role in the loss of American manufacturing jobs. Those jobs have been estimated over the last 10 years to be somewhere between 2 million and 5 million in various studies. That's a tremendous amount of Americans out of work. It's a tremendous loss in middle-class jobs. It's a tremendous loss of families who have their financial foundations have been undercut. So many times when these issues have been raised in the past, folks have said, well, it's protections. Well, you're trying to start a trade war. We have got to get away from that conversation. What we're trying to have is an honest conversation about how this trade relationship is actually working. What is China's actual industrial policy? How do we address that so that the trade relationship works to the benefit of both nations? I think the administration has taken some important steps recently, including the counter notifications that they put out, the list of 200 in October, and President Obama in his State of the Union calling upon and setting up a trade enforcement panel. Those things help to move the conversation forward. So I want to conclude simply by saying that this report is really an enormous contribution to the conversation, because it's a conversation we really haven't been having in America about trying to understand the details of how this trade relationship works and how to make it work in the vision, in accordance with the vision that was originally anticipated to the benefit of both nations. So, well done, and thank you.
Thank you. The center can take a couple of questions at this time. If you want to raise your hand and identify yourself.
Scott Otto with Inside. Scott Otto with Inside U.S.-China Trade. I'm wondering if you're foreseeing in the current Congress any legislative vehicles or activity that could achieve the goals that you've been talking about here in terms of recasting U.S. trade policy to deal with this innovation threat?
Not specifically, no. I think the issue is going to be aired more. There's going to be more and more conversation by folks on both sides of Capitol Hill, House and the Senate, wrestling with this issue. Out of that may come amendments and discussion, but I don't think there's a plan in place. We did have a major conversation over currency manipulation last year, as you might recall, a provision passed by the Senate and pulled out in conference. But I think that that's why I see so much value in reports like the report being aired today, is enhancing or raising to a more sophisticated level a conversation that's really been missing in American economic discussions and needs to be wrestled with. So down the line, yes, I expect there to be a lot more effort to address this. We're trying to expand manufacturing in America. We need to understand the challenges we're facing, and out of that, hopefully will come legislative approaches.
Okay. One more.
Great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So where was I? Drinking. No. It was interesting. The senator waved that list of 200 subsidies, and we've heard what Rob said. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Well, for the same reason that good men get cheated and good horses get ridden, because you can. And so a large part of the assumptions that we're making here are based on our cultural notion that somehow we have all the right answers and that they'll just automatically go along with whatever we say. Well, you know, we lost that position a few years ago. I noticed in my meetings with people coming in from mainland China, especially from the special economic zones, 10 years ago when they would come into our office to talk about creating small business innovation, they were there to listen. They were there to have a discussion about what are some new policies we can put in place. Fast forward through our economic crisis, and the meetings that I had in my office changed to, boy, did you guys screw up. Remember that time you came in and told us about how we should loan out money and all these things that you should do? You have that work out for you. The tenor completely changed. And so I think we've entered into a stage where the American notion of, well, these are the rules and these are what we're doing. I don't think that's me. Huh, yeah. That these are obvious rules, everybody agrees to them, and that's what we're going to move forward on. I think that assumption has to be relooked at. We need to recast our vision and understand the Chinese perspective on it, which is, hey, if those are the rules you set, and we can do it, then we should. And that it's your job to make sure you do a better job at the negotiating table, to make sure that there are metrics in place and other things that can be measured, and we can have that honest discussion. But don't come into here and tell us that you're America and that you know all the answers, and that your solution is the right one. Because from now on, from China's perspective, it's how does it benefit China first, not how does the world see us. There's not anything wrong with that necessarily, as long as you enter into the negotiating phase with that mindset. The second part of all this is you've heard all this Sturm und Drang and how horrible it is, and oh my gosh, American businesses are standing up and raising Cain and the world is caving in. Well, why are American businesses still in China? If it's so awful, if it's so horrible, if it's so impossible to do anything, why are American businesses in there? Well, Charles Dickens, I think it was in Bleak House, said if you could lengthen the skirt of every Chinaman's dress by an inch, the mills of Newcastle would run 24 hours a day or day and night. And I think that you have to understand that American businesses are looking at China and saying 1.5 billion people, a middle class of 500 million people. This year, 60% of all the PCs sold in the world were sold in China. General Motors now sells more cars in China than they sell in America. So we can't just step away from this table and say, no, we don't like the way they play, we're taking our balls and going home. Not happening. What is happening is we have to figure out how to step back at the negotiating table with the Chinese and say, here are the rules, here are the metrics, here's how we expect you to play, and here's how we're going to test that theory. And then the final part of that is, what do you put in place to make sure that that you hold them to it? And this gets to some of what Rob talked about rethinking our tools at USTR and WTO and other organizations so that a company can come into his Chinese partner, his joint venture, and say, I'm horribly sorry about this. My government's going to come in and whack you across the head on this one. I had nothing to do with it. Well, you know what? That's a position the Chinese understand. It happens to them. I've often been in conversations and discussions with a Chinese company where the government puts in a policy and it changes the landscape. And so that's not something where the Chinese, your joint venture partner, is going to attack you because he's being attacked from your government. They understand that separation. And the other key separation that we need to understand that's key part of this culture is Rob and everyone else tends to say China, the Chinese, with like air quotes. Well, China isn't really just one country, indivisible, all the people identical thoughts and identical mindsets. In fact, one of the most famous pieces of Chinese literature is something called Sanguoyini, the Three Kingdoms. And it actually talks about the fact that how China has broken apart and come back together in three distinct kingdoms. And right now, we are seeing kind of an economic three kingdoms. You have the northern part of China, where the government is, and there's certainly a large amount of industry, but you have the merchant class that have existed on the coastal regions in the south of China for millennia. And they absolutely chafe at the pressures from the northern government officials who come in and dictate terms to them and put barriers in between where they are. So you have to understand that we don't start from a position of there is one China and only one China. There are multiple Chinas, there are multiple partners to negotiate with, and each one of them brings their own set of tools to the table. So your Chinese joint venture partner, who you really want to do this deal with, who's getting government pressure, you know what? He's got relationships too. It's important for us as American companies and American government to ask our joint venture partners. Don't depend on government-to-government negotiations. Go into your JV partner and say, hey, I understand that your third cousin's sister's son is actually friends with so-and-so in the party. I need a favor. Because that favor trading is a huge part of Chinese culture. And we need to step to the fore and understand that we should be willing to do some of the same things and bring the same tools. And by the same notion, our government needs to bring to the table those same tools. Our USTR needs to not necessarily just sit across the table, pound on it and say, do it. We need to be willing to say, hey, we understand you're having a problem with Vietnam. Let's figure out how we can work that out. But before we step to the fore against Vietnam, we'd really like you to solve this problem. It's very easy, it's very comfortable for a lot of folks, but I'm not sure our USTR has the tools necessary to make those decisions, and they certainly don't have the resources to put into understanding where all of the pieces are on the chess table. So I think that what Rob has written is really important and critical to read and understand what's being used against American business and America as an economic policy. But I think we need to disabuse ourselves of any notion that we have the ability to tell China how to do their business in this current world. They've beat us in arm wrestling, so to speak, and they're looking at us and thinking, really? What do you bring to the table? And so American business and American government needs to understand that we have a different negotiating position now, and that means we need to use a different set of tools. And finally, Rob pointed out something that I think is absolutely critical. Businesses look at the world environment and say, where do I make money? Where do I achieve growth over a quarterly basis? Where do I make products, sell products, buy raw materials, and put it into this environment in a successful way? And what they look at is, where are the markets? Well, right now, America is the single largest purchaser of goods and services in the world. We are it. We're 300 million people, and we represent, roughly 40% of the Earth's extracted resources and services in any given year. But you know, if America and Europe are together more often, we present a market of nearly 1 billion people. So if I'm a businessman and I'm saying, where do I go? Where is my market opportunity? Where can I make money in a quarterly basis and return it to shareholders? And you present me this fractured market of America of 300 million, Europe of some amount of 500, 700 million, or China at 600, 700 million. Well, why wouldn't I jump ship and go over to dealing with the Chinese for their standards and for their other things? So as we move forward, we need to arm USTR with the better tools. We need to understand how to work with our partners in Europe and around the world to better achieve our benefits. And we need to stop thinking that we have the God-given right to have all the right answers, because it's a new world out there and the Chinese are here to play.
First of all, Rob, thank you for the opportunity, and certainly commend you and ITF for the work you're continuing to do. I would also just commend to the audience Rob's excellent work on innovation in the APEC context, which was released around APEC last year, and is a tremendous addition to the discussion on innovation broadly in the Asia-Pacific region, and with a focus to some degree on China. I would just first start out by saying, well, first of all, I want to cover 3 points here. And first, I think with regard to the challenge that Rob lays out, I think we by and large agree. And we agree to the extent that the U.S. Chamber we issued our own report, our own assessment back in 2010, titled China's Drive for Indigenous Innovation and Web of Industrial Policy. Some of you may have seen this. It's on our website, but certainly very complimentary. I would say Rob's piece is certainly, I think we're largely in agreement and very complementary. The two reports are quite complementary in terms of describing the challenge, and as well as why China, what the history is here, why China is doing what it's doing, and I think to the point that Rob you made, which is 2005, 2006 really represented an inflection point in terms of really reform slowing down, perhaps almost going backwards to some degree, and industrial policy playing a much larger role with the advent of the medium and long-term science and technology development plan and follow-on industrial policies, many of which are tied to indigenous innovation. We certainly agree with regard to the issues, Rob, that you tick off in your report, the challenges with regard to procurement, forced technology transfer, challenges with regard to the patent system in China. In fact, the Chamber will be issuing a report soon on China's utility model patent regime and some of the challenges, some recommendations for reform of that regime in a manner that will help China, I think, with its innovation, with its own innovation goals. Certainly the concerns regarding IP theft, both with regard to continuing challenges of lax protection and enforcement, but also increasingly trade secret theft, cyber theft, the SOE issue, tax issues. I think there's general agreement, and our own report, our own assessment on behalf of the business community reflects that concern. We also agree that there is a false dichotomy among the various camps, including between those who see China as destined to fail and those who see a China that can do no wrong. There's no question that we have serious concerns about China's approach regarding innovation, which to date has too often amounted to what we would consider a closed technology strategy. And consequently, there is a lack of trust among many of our companies when it comes to evaluating the goals of indigenous innovation, as well as how they can participate in China's innovation drive without having their IP compromised or stolen. And we very much agree, Rob, with your assessment that Chinese policy in recent years has been focused far too much on maximizing short-term consumer, or not been focused, in fact, on maximizing short-term consumer welfare, and far more so on maximizing long-term producer welfare, where the owners of the factors of production is the party. We agree with the distinguishing characteristics about the policy, so there are a lot of areas of agreement. I think you correctly pointed out that there has been some progress on the issue of indigenous innovation product accreditation lists, and I would just note that we at U.S. Chamber, with other associations, worked very hard in the fall of 2009 and into 2010 and really in bringing together a global coalition of interested business associations in Europe, in Japan, in Korea, and elsewhere to reshape China's policy and to support our respective governments to raise the issue with China. And I think we did see some results, certainly the Hu Jintao visit and even the most recent JCCT, where there was this State Council directive basically instructing the provinces to, as you put it, I think, at least stop writing about and stop applying. Though I think there was actually some substantive progress there, but it is whack-a-mole, and there is a steady stream, no question, of industrial policy measures, new mandatory standards. There's no question that far too much of the 12th Five-Year Plan appears to be rooted in subsidies, support for state-owned enterprises, mandatory standards developed by state champions. Certainly there was recently an MIT product, a new heavy equipment catalog that the U.S. Chamber provided some comments to the Chinese side on, but certainly while some of the strategy has changed in China, perhaps, or some of the tactics have changed, the direction of policy remains very much intact, notwithstanding some of the progress on indigenous innovation. In terms of solutions, I would just say that general agreement, Rob, with the range of solutions or a range of approaches that can be taken. Although I think, note that there's probably more going on in this area already than the report indicates. So, for example, we and others in the business community have been very active in championing a new set of disciplines in the TPP, specifically with regard to state-owned enterprises. And that's not so much about trying to contain China, but really about ensuring that we are fostering market-based approaches to competition and innovation. The U.S. Chamber has been quite active in championing a new economic and trade partnership with Europe, and this is really starting to get traction. And certainly there will be benefits in terms of setting new rules of the road, raising the bar, a higher standard agreement that China and others must meet if they want to continue to have access to global markets. But really not about containing China, but reinforcing our own approach to doing business and to driving growth and innovation. Agree that there is a need for more creative and assertive approaches to developing and exercising bilateral leverage where appropriate, although I think we need to be clear that there are no silver bullets. Certainly USTR, Commerce Department, and others need more resources, but we also need to be careful that we're not taking cases that we can't win to the WTO, because if there are adverse decisions, those adverse decisions that might in effect bless China's approach in some areas probably would make it harder for us to deal with those issues down the road. So we need to be mindful of that there are no silver bullets, that the WTO is not comprehensive, and China is certainly exploiting some of those loopholes. But we need to be strategic in our approach. And I would say that certainly while getting our own house in order isn't an automatic cure for dealing with some of the challenges that have been alluded to here today with China, certainly it is a key element. We do need to get our own fiscal house in order. Certainly that will increase our leverage in talking to the China more, and this is a point that certainly you made in your remarks. And I would also note that it's important as we think about getting our own house in order that that the U.S. government is ensuring that that domestic policies, the policies we're pursuing domestically with regard to antitrust, with regard to intellectual property, with regard to regulation broadly, standard setting, are aligned with and reflect our international economic priorities and our trade policy priorities, because that is not always the case. And in fact, oftentimes you will see we are not immune. We'll see the U.S. government pursuing one set of policies domestically, but a different set of policies with regard to trade. And obviously that undermines the leverage of U.S. negotiators when they're not walking the walk and talking the talk. Just one last set of points on the broader context, because I think certainly the report, again, does do an excellent job of highlighting the challenges with regard to innovation and industrial policies, but certainly the U.S.-China relationship is broader than this one set of issues. And I think Morgan, you correctly alluded to the context here that China is a tremendous opportunity. Taking our marbles, gathering our marbles off the table and going home is not really an option. China is our fastest growing export market. There are increasingly opportunities, I would say win-win opportunities associated with Chinese investment in the United States to create jobs here, to assist with some of our infrastructure needs. And the other point I would make is that, and I think you alluded to that as well, is that China is not a monolith. And the World Bank 2030 report that was released yesterday in Beijing by President Zelek, I think underscores this point. That was, as we understand it, a joint effort by the World Bank and the Development Research Center of the Chinese State Council. And the report is quite candid on issues in prescribing a different approach for China with regard to state-owned enterprises. It advocates a whole series of structural reforms that China needs to undertake. There's a chapter on innovation policy. And again, I don't want to overstate the influence of the State Council's think tank, but this was co-signed by the State Council's think tank. And I think it does underscore that there's a possibility that the pendulum could, with emphasis on could, be beginning to swing the other way. And certainly there are ongoing debates in China about these issues. There is frustration about the role of state-owned enterprises in the economy within China. Just to wrap up here, I think there's also some reason to hope that China's equities in the international system will at some point cause a period of reflection and hopefully lead to some policies of what I would term enlightened self-interest. There's no question that countries like Brazil, India, Russia are seeking to emulate China, and Robbie correctly pointed this out. But at the same time, much of what they're doing is admittedly a defensive reaction to China's mercantilism. It's not solely about we want to follow China. So, for example, Brazil just instituted a new policy on autos, which clearly targets China. It's a policy that will go into effect for just a year. But it's very much an industrial policy in reaction to Chinese industrial policies, not necessarily a policy that Brazil is taking because they support or are endorsing the Beijing consensus. Similarly, India's ICT policies, I would say, were in large measure a reaction to some of China's industrial policies in the ICT area. So in short, China's zero-sum approach in some areas has the potential to endanger the access to and openness of the global economy that is critical for China's future success. And finally, China's desire to invest abroad will also bring with it new pressures by subjecting Chinese companies to rule of law and new enforcement measures in our economy, in Europe, in Japan, elsewhere, and also will be, I think, a curb on some of the policies that we're seeing in China today. So I will leave it there. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Morgan and Jeremy, for those comments, which were very helpful. So why don't we just open it up if you have, just identify yourself and
Sure. Dan Newman with the Joint Economic Committee Majority Staff. I really enjoyed looking through the report and hearing from everybody today. I think both of your co-presenters were right when they talked about the factions and the fact that China is not a monolith and that there are, there could be potential changes coming in that regard. One thing in particular is we're going to see a change in Chinese leadership coming up within the year. To what extent are any of the panelists hopeful or reticent that some of the new folks, it's obviously a very opaque system about who will in fact end up where, but based on where things seem to be going, are you hopeful that things might improve, or are you worried that this next generation might take the current approach and either continue it or make it worse?
Well, I think part of it starts with an assumption that sounds weird that the head of the government actually matters.
Right.
Again, diving into back, old Chinese sayings, which, by the way, they're very common, is, you don't really care who the government is as long as the rice is growing. And I think that that's a really important part of what's going on. When I talk about the southern parts of China, the coastal parts of China, their ability to make decisions about how they will operate in a joint venture mode has a lot to do with them independently and less to do with who technically is the head of the government in Beijing. So I'm hopeful, but I'm more hopeful that the benefits that will accrue to domestic producers in China will be such that there'll be some self-motivation for it. So the head of the government, I think we have to worry less about that. We need to focus on on the smaller tactical moves that we can make. Strategically, it's too hard to say.
So you're less concerned about, I'm sorry, Jeremy.
I'm sorry, I'll let Jeremy go.
Yeah, I think it's just really hard to say.
Sure.
There are analyses out there of Vice President Xi,
right,
of Executive Vice Premier Li Keqiang that say they're going to be, they're going to follow a certain path, or the people know what's in their souls, and they know the direction they're going to pursue. I think we have to appreciate that the party has traditionally bred. China is very much a consensus-based system. These are people within the system, so to expect sweeping change, certainly early on, is probably unrealistic. At the same time, there are these, you do see like this recent report, which the DRC seemed to have a real hand in. Obviously Vice President Xi, as a former party secretary, in some of the coastal provinces, in Zhejiang and Fujian, where entrepreneurial activity is at a, private enterprise has been critical. I mean, there are, there are some rumors that perhaps some in the Chinese leadership, some of the princelings in particular, may not be entirely pleased with the direction of the economy, and the fact that some of the important decisions that need to be taken with regard to the next stage of economic reform have been delayed. So there are reasons to think that there may be, and the 12th five-year plan, finally, I would just add, does put some of these issues, structural reform is at the core of the 12th five-year plan. SOE reform is mentioned in the 12th five-year plan. Now those, you can get to some of those issues without really addressing the core of the issues. So it will be a question of degree. Clearly, China's going to move in a somewhat different direction, but how that impacts U.S. interests, how that impacts foreign companies, whether the changes are such that it moves China away from the strategy, as you pointed out, of cultivating national champions. I think we just don't know. I would be pretty cautious, though. I don't think we're going to see a tremendous shift.
I would just add to that. I think a lot of people mistake the 12th five-year plan because there's some nice language in there that goes in that direction, just as there is in the new World Bank report. But both of those reports, including the World Bank report, they still embraced export-led growth through moving up the value chain. The World Bank report says that, and so I actually want to make sure we get enough time. So, Robert,
Claudio Lilienthal from McClarty Associates. Really interesting, because what you did, Rob, is outline very well the policy challenges that we face in China. Morgan, you kind of gave us a reality check of both perceptions and, to some extent, the tools that we do or don't have at our disposal. And the sum total of what we've got here, there's one big thing that's missing, because you've also outlined briefly that India and Brazil and others are starting to, for whatever their incentives are, they're either mimicking or defending themselves. But in either case, one of the things they're seeing is that China doesn't have a disincentive for doing what it's doing. It's continued to benefit, and we do this bleating of complaining about all the policy challenges that we face, but we have no tools at our disposal, or few tools at our disposal. And one of the challenges, which you also outlined, or one or more of you did, is the fact that we have corporate interests, and we have this political divide even here domestically, and we're facing this challenge in our own job creation policies and the export policy of how the Chinese are in essence able to play our our divided system for their advantage. And what tools? This is the big gap here. Is what tools do we have at our disposal? How do we solve the problem of we are the good guys, if we want to call it that, but we have entities that have their interests, and we don't have the ability to affect change. And watching India now grappling with these very things, and now we are in a preventive mode with them. How do we deal with that?
well, just quick, I think a couple things. One of the assertions I make in the report is that I do think things are evolving to the point more like Japan back in the 80s, where you had a more unified U.S. corporate community that was pressing the government to take stronger action. That's, I think, where we're evolving to. More and more U.S. companies are getting, as Senator Merkley said, more and more frustrated. So that old divide, if you will, I think, between people who wanted to kind of protect versus open and globalize, I think that's changing. So I think you'll see more support for companies to say, you know, the correct strategic, non-over-the-top kind of pressure with China is going to be in their interest. In terms of what are the tools, I think part of this really ultimately is about, as Morgan said, it's partly about tools, but it's also about if you could form an alliance, if you could get a lot of, I think part of it, we just haven't raised this up as a serious enough issue. And yeah, there are going to be specific tools, and I agree with Jeremy that we don't want to be taking cases that we're going to be losing, but we can take more cases. We can press for new kinds of trade agreements that have much stronger, I mean, the WTO is a flawed system, fundamentally. It's a tariff trade barrier system. It's not a non-tariff barrier system. Right. And so we've got to think about it, and TPP and a TAP could move us in that direction. So I'm going to go here and then here. Yes, sir.
Just to build on what Claudio mentioned, my name is Mike Bush. I'm with Washington, D.C. Economic Partnership. To be a little bit more specific, we had mentioned corporate interests, and we talked a lot today about U.S. policies, international policies that we can do to change this behavior. I mean, sure, corporations have an interest, but do they have a role in actively trying to make these changes, you know, with that question in the light of, you know, companies like Apple being pretty publicly accused of exploiting that relationship we have with China?
Well, look, I don't think Apple's exploiting a relationship with China. It is what it is, and any company who doesn't take advantage of it is not a very, it's not acting in their own self-interest. And we can't expect companies to not act in their own self-interest. That's what our system is all about. What we have to do, I mean, there's two things. It's one thing for companies to oppose the U.S. government to take action on their behalf. I don't see that happening, particularly now. So the real question is, I don't think we can sit back and wait for companies to take the lead. They're not going to, nor should they. And I think it's incumbent upon the government to take the lead and to take action on their behalf. And I think if that happens, we can make more progress.
I think one thing to understand is you have to say, what does China need? What are the next steps for China? Now, yes, there are intellectual property theft, there's all the tech transfer, but you know what? They're a regional hegemon. They have concerns about Vietnam. They have other issues with some of their regional neighbors. Low-cost labor, which is how we made how we all got cheap stuff at Walmart from China, is moving. It's moving to other regions in the area. And those nations are now starting to steal intellectual property from China. China is actually an intellectual property leader in some areas on solar panel technology, some very narrow areas. And that stuff's being reproduced in Vietnam and Indonesia and Laos and other countries around the region. And the Chinese are torqued. They don't like it. Well, there's an opportunity. So saying, what can you do for America? Not going to work. How can America and China partner together? And oh, by the way, we need this fixed at the same time. That has a chance of working. Those are the kinds of tools that we need to look at, and we need to start with the perspective of.
And the World Bank report, I think, while it's not perfect, I agree with Rob, it does highlight some of the areas of opportunity where clearly there are voices within China that see some issues with their approach, that want to move China forward, and the report does lay out some areas where we can work together. I would only say, just to the just asked question, that the approach and to the idea of the U.S. taking cases to protect national interest, even if there isn't explicit corporate endorsement, I think that argues for a much closer partnership between the business community and government at very senior levels on these issues, much deeper discussion.
There's got to be some hand-holding.
And it can't just be done at a working level. It really has to be done, and there needs to be leadership there to kind of to advance that dialogue, because there is concern. Companies are subject to retaliation. Europe has it even worse, far worse. I would, in terms of, in fact, a Business Europe report that was issued over the summer spends a lot of time talking about how China has divided and conquered Europe through threats of retaliation against various companies in Europe. So it's a difficult challenge, and one that needs to be worked through.
So we're running a little over time, which is my fault, but we'll go until 11:10. If anybody needs to leave, feel free. We'll go to 11:10. Yes, sir.
Hi, Merrill Guzner with the Fiscal Times. Somebody who covered these issues in Japan in the 1980s and early 1990s pretty closely. As I was listening to you as you outlined your report, I said all you had to do was scratch out the word China and put Japan, and it would have sounded a lot similar to what you said back then. There's a big difference between now and then. If I look around the United States, I don't see a single, the equivalent of a Toyota dealership or a Honda dealership. If I went back and forth, I don't see Chinese branded machine tools. I don't see Chinese steel. It is coming, it could be coming into the United States, but we don't get a sense of them doing any foreign direct investment into the United States. And quite frankly, for the American people, the idea of losing jobs to China is sort of like they never were here to be lost to China, many of them, in the first place. If we look at the consumer, the biggest example we're giving is Apple, but the consumer electronics industry left this country 25 years ago. So we didn't lose any of those jobs. So my question sort of becomes this. It's kind of political. It's like, how do you raise political interest in this issue when people really don't perceive the direct threat to their own jobs? It sounds to me, quite frankly, that this is more about American business getting access to the Chinese market, which can be very important for jobs, and I don't disagree with that. But it's very difficult for people to see the connection when they don't see the benefit.
I think quickly, that's with a large umbrella, but in a small umbrella, I don't think that's true at all. Recently, I guess it was 4 years ago now, 5 years ago, when we lifted the tariffs on Chinese manufactured T-shirts. I remember hearing Missy on the radio on NPR saying that there was a 7,000% increase in t-shirt imports from China, and there are no more t-shirt making textile mills in the Carolinas. Gone. Furniture manufacturing, gone. So there are plenty of people who see jobs gone from China. Now, that doesn't change the fact that it may not be something that could have been solved, and we should have lifted those barriers. But I think there's plenty of perception amongst Americans that there are industries that have moved abroad, especially through intellectual property theft. I hear that a lot. I can't compete with this Chinese company that's making this water bottle. We make identical water bottles, but I buy all this software. They buy none of it. So even if I had the exact same labor cost and was more efficient, I still can't beat them because they got all the free software, the accounting software, the AutoCAD, all that stuff. They got it for free. They stole it. Their product's cheaper. I hear stories like that from small manufacturers who thrived through the Japan era by innovating, who now say, wait a minute, I did all that, and I'm getting crushed. So I think it's a misnomer. And on your, can you scratch out Japan? The only problem with that is, what's the population of Japan? Anyone? Yeah, exactly. What's the population of China?
1.2 billion.
Yeah, 1.5. So you know what? I understand there's a lot in the report that's reminiscent, but the difference is the size of the market opportunity for U.S. business. And that we never have in Japan the same way that American businesses see China in the long run.
And I would just add that, in fact, China is far more open than Japan ever was.
Yeah,
Okay?
that's true too.
So there's much more benefit there for American companies and American workers in terms of what they've been able to do in China. I mean, I would just note that I think the statistic is during the recent economic downturn here post-financial crisis, I think U.S. multinationals created something on the order of 650 or 750,000 jobs. That's I think a Commerce Department statistic or a census. So here in the United States, when obviously we were hemorrhaging jobs, you know, and obviously exports to China held up far better. U.S. exports to China held up far better in the downturn than they did to anywhere else in the world. And exports to China have resumed at a you know, are now increasing at a very rapid clip. So you know, there are significant differences between Japan, you know, and China. We had more leverage with Japan as well. Obviously, we don't have that was, you know, so there are differences.
I think it's time for one last question.
This is almost more of a comment. It seems like, oh sorry, yeah, my name is Alex Woods, Wesley Group. A lot of what we seem to be disagreeing about revolves around leverage, and I think we have a lot more leverage than is commonly understood, and that is our imports and our domestic trade laws. And I think you raise that, and your report is fantastic, but I think it's unfair that that is characterized as protectionist, because it's not. We're you know, we're bearing all the costs here. And so yeah, if you have
just a quick comment on that. I mean, whether it's protectionist or not, we could spend another hour. But I think a key point with regard to trade remedies, not really leverage, because trade remedies, for the most part, are private, you know, private rights. The private actors bring those cases, and they go through the system, a system that's transparent and fair, I think, that's consistent with the rules of the WTO. But it's not something that you can put forward and then take away to generate a policy outcome in China. That doesn't constitute leverage. It may constitute. You may be protecting your industry, or you may not be. You know, I think, you know, for example, in the tires case, there's real question as to whether, you know, that you know, benefited the U.S. economy, saved jobs. There are differing views on that. But the question of, you know, leverage is about pursuing, you know, using some lever to get something that you want, and it's not clear that trade remedies constitutes leverage for that reason.
I know what you're saying, Jeremy, and I think your point, you know, trade remedies around individual industry cases may not get leveraged, but I think on a broader level. I mean, I think one way to think about this is, let's just say, which I'm not saying is the case, but hypothetically, just for the sake of argument, that the China threat is an existential threat to the entire U.S. system, and if we don't address it, we will have our children will have per capita incomes of 25% of what they have today. Okay, not happening. use that as a mental model, we would figure out something to do. We would do something. We would not let that result happen. And so I think that's the key point here, is that I agree with you, we have more leverage. And the question really is how seriously we want to use it. We've not been, we're much more about you ramp up your pressure. You don't go with the nuclear, wrong example, but you don't go with the sort of most extreme measure at the beginning. You work your way up, but you have that in the background. So let me just close by saying, first of all, which I shouldn't have to say this, but I know I have to say it anyway. Our goal is to have China be an integral part of the global system. It is valuable for the global economy to have global supply chains in China. It's valuable to have them get wealthy. We want that to happen. So this is not at all a call of somehow saying globalization shouldn't happen, that China shouldn't get rich. Absolutely. But it should be done really through the kinds of practices that we engage in, that the Australians engage in, the British engage in, the Germans engage in, and not through the kinds of practices that they're essentially doing so much today. So on that note, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking two great panelists.